So it's been a wonderful pleasure to organize such an event with such wonderful colleagues to participate. The title, Interdisciplinary Research at MIT, Making Uncommon Connections, I think represents the serendipitous and incredible connections that are often made in research at MIT and lead to all kinds of exciting new endeavors. But I'll start by introducing our first speaker, Roz Williams, Professor Roz Williams, who is the director of the program in Science, Technology, and Society. Roz has been at MIT since 1980 and has published several books, most recently a book called Retooling, A Historian Confronts Technological Change, which I highly recommend as both a personal and inside view of some of the wonderful things that do go on at MIT. And she's here today to give us a very brief overview of interdisciplinary work at MIT entitled The Multidisciplinary Forest of MIT From Twigs to Canopy. Thanks, Roz.
I'm very pleased, but I have to say a little surprised to be highlighting interdisciplinary research at MIT on this very important occasion, because it was only a short time ago, very short time ago, that interdisciplinary studies were radical, suspect, disreputable, regarded often as sloppy and impure, and often also tainted by their association with the 60s. The 27-year-old history of STS, my own department, Science, Technology, and Society. By the way, I'm going to call it a department because it's called a program officially, but it functions like a department, so I just don't want to confuse you. Is actually an excellent example, my friend, of the importance of presidential leadership in either promoting or not promoting interdisciplinarity. Because STS was started by then President Jerry Wiesner and Provost Walter Rosenblith, who for very deeply personal reasons decided MIT needed such a program and started it in 1976. When they stepped down in 1980, it began a period of, well, let's just say STS was fighting for its survival through most of the 1980s. There was a general sense on the part of many deans and provosts during that period that those slots and resources could be better used elsewhere. And there's a long history of back and forth. Well, STS did survive, but only barely. Well, how times have changed. Now we're talking about interdisciplinarity as a very important aspect of all of MIT. And I will say, if we didn't now have an STS program at MIT, we'd have to invent it. Because by the early 21st century, it's not just humanists and scientists who understand the value of interdisciplinary studies. We all know that we live in a world where the human and social phenomena are so intertwined with non-human nature that we need a range of intellectual tools to understand this world, to address its problems, and to make creative breakthroughs. We all know that we live in a world where the human and social phenomena are so intertwined with non-human nature that we need a range of intellectual tools to understand this world, to address its problems, and to make creative breakthroughs. We all understand that you can't separate value issues in science, for example, like ethics, from the harder issues of lab equipment when stem cells are part of the lab equipment. We all understand that nanotechnology is not just a matter of molecules, but of public understanding, because it will never fulfill its promise if people are terrified of it. By the way, I prefer the term multidisciplinary rather than interdisciplinary, because I think in so many situations, projects, problems, you need this range of disciplines brought to the project or problem. It may or may not lead to a new discipline, which is what is sometimes implied by interdisciplinary studies. It may or may not, it doesn't have to. So multidisciplinary to me is a little more open-ended. But in any case, I'm gratified to see that science and engineering are now openly and unapologetically acknowledging the value of multidisciplinarity that the social sciences and humanities have long understood. Actually, I want to go back a couple hundred years, because I would like to interpret for you the history of the modern world in general and MIT in particular as the convergence of two very different disciplines, disciplines understood in the deep sense of approaches to understanding the world. And they are, on the one hand, science, and on the other, technology. MIT is built on this convergence. But this is something new in history. This is a novel democratic culture where a particular type of knowledge, scientific knowledge, is linked to a particular type of activity, which we now call technological, to increase human power. We take this for granted, but it is not at all obvious. Through most of human history, scientific understanding, the quest to understand the nature of things, has been aristocratic, elitist, speculative, intellectual. It's flourished in specific times and places over the centuries, but has been always of that intellectualistic and speculative character. Technology, on the other hand, which has also flourished over the centuries, though more so in sometimes in places than others, but it's been more lower class, empirical, and action-oriented. So what is new in history is their convergence, their universality, and apparently unstoppable momentum in uniting into technoscience. And I want to quote here from a historian, Lynn White, Jr., who is giving, and this is a good example of interdisciplinarity, it's a historian who is giving a speech to the AAAS in 1967. It was published in Science magazine under the title, The Historical Roots of the Ecologic Crisis. And this is what Lynn White, Jr. says about this convergence I've just described. It was not until about 4 generations ago that Western Europe and North America arranged a marriage between science and technology, a union of the theoretical and empirical approaches to the natural environment. The emergence in widespread practice of the Baconian creed that scientific knowledge means technological power over nature can scarcely be dated before about 1850. Its acceptance as a normal pattern of action may mark the greatest event in human history since the invention of agriculture, and perhaps in non-human terrestrial history as well, end quote. Lynn White goes on to note, the sudden fusion of these two in the middle of the 19th century is surely related to the slightly prior and contemporary democratic revolutions, which, by reducing social barriers, tended to assert a functional unity of brain and hand. The consequence, White concluded, is an entirely novel democratic culture, using knowledge to increase power, with still unimaginable consequences for ecological and political environments. And he goes on to ask whether a democratized world can survive its own implications. Plan for MIT in 1861, and I quote from this plan, "The most truly practical education, even in an industrial point of view, is one founded on a thorough knowledge of scientific laws and principles, and one which unites with habits of close observation and exact reasoning, a large general cultivation." So, from the start, the curriculum was multidisciplinary at MIT. You had to know not just the craft knowledge, but science, management, writing, history, economics, modern languages. A hybrid of general and liberal, and professional education. This is not respectable. It is multidisciplinary. Certainly in the view of institutions like our neighbor up the river, this was not respectable. MIT has always been a hybrid, a college of arts and sciences and an engineering school, and I put that in quotes, and the tension between these two has been the great source of strength over the past 150 years. But there's a second phase, and if there is any important post-war trend that's distinctive to the post-war era at MIT, it's the emergence of what I would call social science-based engineering. The shock of the war, and especially the shock of the atomic bomb, made many at MIT realize the importance of understanding of increasing the understanding of the human world as part of education here. It was clear to everyone as never before that science and technology were inseparable from social purposes and structures. People were thinking clearly because they had really had their minds had been messed up by the war. And afterwards, they really were thinking things through very carefully. Actually, this was put more succinctly by Winston Churchill. There was the famous mid-century convocation here at MIT, culminating again in another inauguration, that of Jim Killian as MIT president. In his inaugural speech, Jim Killian goes on to tell this story. This is his inaugural address. It says, "Night before last, when I was returning with Mr. Churchill, who had given the keynote address for the convocation, from the garden," that means Boston Garden, when I was returning with him to his hotel, he leaned over to me and said, "As you advance science at your great institution, don't neglect the humanities." And I told him, as I tell you today, that we have not and will not.
Ladies and gentlemen, I frankly confess that I feel somewhat overawed in addressing this vast scientific and learned audience on the subjects which your panels are discussing. I have no technical and no university education, and have just had to pick up a few things as I went along. Therefore, I speak with a diffidence, which I hope to overcome as I proceed, on these profound scientific, social, and philosophic issues, each of which claims a lifelong study for itself and are now to be examined, as schoolmen would say, not only in their integrity, but in their relationships, meaning thereby not only one by one, but all together. Science presently placed novel and dangerous facilities in the hands of the most powerful countries. Humanity was informed that it could make machines that would fly through the air and vessels which could swim beneath the surface of the seas. The conquest of the air and the perfection of the art of flying fulfilled the dream which for thousands of years had glittered in human imagination. Certainly it was a marvelous and romantic event. Whether the bestowal of this gift upon an immature civilization composed of competing nations whose nationalism grew with every advance of democracy and who were as yet devoid of international organization, whether this gift was a blessing or a curse has yet to be proved. On the whole, I remain an optimist. No technical knowledge can outweigh knowledge of the humanities, in the gaining of which philosophy and history walk hand in hand. Our inheritance of well-founded, slowly conceived codes of honor, morals, and manners, the passionate convictions which so many hundreds of millions share together of the principles of freedom and justice, are far more precious to us than anything which scientific discoveries could bestow. Those whose minds are attracted or compelled to rigid and symmetrical systems of government should remember that logic, like science, must be the servant and not the master of man. Human beings and human societies are not structures that are built or machines that are forged. They are plants that grow and must be tended as such. life is a test, and this world a place of trial. Always the problems, or it may be the same problem, will be presented to every generation in different forms. The problems of victory may even be more baffling than those of defeat. However much the conditions change, the supreme question is how we live and grow and bloom and die, and how far each human life conforms to standards which are not wholly related to space or time.
The really deep multidisciplinarity comes not just getting science and technology together, or humanities and social sciences, it's getting them all together, particularly getting science, technology, and society. This brings me finally to my metaphor of the forest, which I named this talk before I wrote it. So began thinking of universities as a grove. They bring together a multiplicity of disciplines and professions. They grow up together, and as they do, they modify each other. And the way they interact is important in the growth of each of the plants. Disciplinary trees must and should remain, but as they grow twigs and then branches, they gradually develop a forest canopy where the real vitality and power may flourish, where interesting things may happen. So let us hope that MIT becomes a sacred grove. Thank you.